would like to welcome you now to our discussion round on Connect for Impact, Africa and Europe. We have a little technical problem, so unfortunately we will see a picture instead of a video of our fantastic moderator of this session, WSA board member and national expert for Ghana, Miss Dorothy Gordon. Dorothy, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Manuela, and let me agree with you that this has been a fantastic session so far. And I know that we're going to have a very engaging discussion with our 4 panelists. And our panelists are drawn from both Europe and Africa. We have Sakhile, who many of you would know as someone who has run his own startup and now is looking at how to attract more investment into Africa. The same with Nkemdilim, somebody who's running many companies. And then we have Tanja and Lena from Europe, who are both of them very into gender issues, as well as what it means for Tanja, very interesting background from the Balkans. And for Lena, who I had the pleasure to meet, I think, when I was in Austria last for the WSA Congress, also looking at that whole logic of how Africa connects with Europe and Europe connects with Africa. So let's get the ball rolling. Sakhile, you know, it's very much discussed today. Where is Africa looking for partnership? Is it the old partnerships which are perceived to be more focused on Europe? Or when it comes to tech, Europe is not seen as a leader. It is Asia and the US. Why would Africa be looking at Europe in terms of partnership? What kind of opportunities do you see for that kind of connection between the two that perhaps wouldn't exist with others?
Yeah, good morning to everybody. Yeah, I think, Dorothy, from where I stand, we look at things like skills transfer, right? I think Africa is in a fortunate position where we're growing at the rate at which we're growing at, but there's also a side effect of that, or a double-edged sword, is that we're growing at a fast rate, but we're not producing talent fast enough for our startups, for our companies, right? And so I think there's an interesting potential collaboration between talent from Europe coming to Africa to really plug in that gap, but also maybe a knowledge transfer of the talent that currently exists in Africa in those positions that we need to scale our business.
Okay, apart from
on the
skills,
thing right now is skills transfer.
Okay, well, we can park that for the moment. We'll get back to it, but I think one of the interesting dimensions of skills transfer is always that gender balance. And we see that men still very much dominate, even in Europe, the digital space. So Tanja, do you see that there's anything particularly specific that we could do in terms of empowering women with this connection between the two continents? What's your experience there in terms of skills, which Sakhile was just talking about?
Yes, most certainly. I completely agree with Sakhile just said. And I've been working with girls and women in the tech industry, in the tech sphere for the past 4 years in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the Western Balkan region. And we can see the global trends are not favorable for women in learning STEM areas or getting careers in the ICT sector. Although many countries have dramatically closed gender gaps in education and labor force participation, gender differences within education and employment persist. And this trend is unfortunately not just evident in Europe and Africa, but also like in many developed countries as well, such as US predominantly. We really need to work together, cooperate, startups as well as small and medium-sized businesses if we want to close these gender gaps in entrepreneurship and basically ensure incomes and productivity on both sides, I would say on both continents.
Do you really see, I mean, gender is a very cultural thing. Do you really think that the ways that would be used to solve the issue would work across the continents? And I'll let you think about that while I engage with Nkem. Nkem, sort of touching on that issue, would approaches to getting women more involved in tech work across the continent? The two continents, what do you think about transfer of business models between the two continents? Sakhile has talked about skills transfer, but working together, do we see a sync between the way business is done and the way business should be done?
Thank you very much, Dorothy. I think it's a bit of a tough one because it really depends on the industry and sort of the sector. I think there are some business models that are highly transferable, and then there are other business models that simply would not work due to regulation, due to cultural nuances, or due to even the availability of infrastructure here on the continent, right? So I think it's always important to have a lot of agility and flexibility in how we approach, sort of transfer and adoption of business models. To the, sort of second part of the question around, how do you get more women into tech and whether the same methods would work? I think a lot of the, sort of barriers of why women don't, sort of look at tech as their first choice are very similar. And I think a lot of the programs that work in Europe also work on the continent, like mentoring, sort of having all girls boot camps and code camps just to introduce them at an early age and make sure that they are, they actually understand what technology is and having role models in the space, right? I think those things work very similarly. However, when you then look at the cultural nuances and sort of the role of the woman in society, I do think that the role of the woman in the society in Europe is a little bit more advanced than what we see here on the continent, which means that you then have to deal with that once you actually get the women into tech, right? So I think what I've seen over the years is there's so much effort to get girls and women into tech, and then they get in and they just don't hack it and they need to leave because they need to be home to cook for their husband. They need to, pick up the kids from school. They need to do so many additional things that men don't have to do. And it is much easier in Europe to tell your partner, okay, part of this is your job. Whereas here at home, it's very different and even very progressive, sort of women still deal with exactly these same things, right? Where there's a cultural and societal norm that, sort of almost expects you to do these things. So either you have enough money to build a support system, which most entry-level women don't have, and that makes the attrition rate of women who actually get in really, really high. And I think we need to figure out how do we address that? How do we also look at models that maybe work around childcare, around sort of housework and outsourcing.
So Nkem, what I'm hearing so far from the session is that nobody is focusing on money in terms of how financing from Europe could help us out. They're kind of focusing on special initiatives like gender, and some of you have mentioned young people, getting more young people engaged and around this. And I think that really leads us into the crux of the issue here. And so I'm going to be asking each of you in turn, but I'll start with Lena. We're talking about Connect for Impact. Where do you see those advantages of connecting for impact between Europe and Africa?
Yeah, I think what I can say from my perspective, working mostly with female founders, also like getting them engaged with investors mostly, so also a topic that we touched upon here in Europe. And I had a few teams also that I worked with from Asia, some of them from the US, but mostly like really worked with many different female founded teams from Europe. I can say that it was also always really, really interesting to engage with different ecosystems. So I think for all of us, it's always really good to, like, it's all about, like, innovation is always about exchanging, seeing something different, getting inspired by something different. So I think we could all really benefit from engaging more with other continents, with other mindsets, with other cultures. I think what the impact could also be is, like, in my experience with working with entrepreneurs always want to change lives with their ideas, or really have a positive impact with ideas. And mostly when we worked with less developed ecosystems, so this, for example, in the connection Austria to Germany, Austria is way less developed ecosystem than Germany. I'm from Austria, and we were working a lot with Germans as well. Then you can always see that in the less developed ecosystems, you could still have a bigger impact with the ideas that you're realizing, because there is not that many ideas that already have been realized. And I think this is something that really draws me about the Africa Europe topic as well, that actually often the impact that you can have with an idea is way more, it's better in a less developed ecosystem. So I think this is something that I would also consider, or this is what really draws me to also doing business in Africa, is realizing something that people really need, and not something where I have the feeling that, especially talking about the US, but also in some parts of Europe, doing something that is there in 14 other Bahrains already, doing it for the 15th time, and then really needing to, like, market it heavily so people are actually going to use it. So I hope you know what I mean, but this is, I think,
definitely
there.
Yeah, I think those are some really interesting ideas. You know, the knowledge sharing, the cultural and you could say insight benefits of working together, and making a difference, because you see an ecosystem that is in the process of growing. I think that we will come back to women, but as we go forward, looking at that Connect for Impact discussion, let's also think about younger people. And then I'm really interested in the money angle, because let's face it, if you ask any startup, even if many of us know that it's actually skills which are very important, I think most people would say we need some more money. So Sakhile, what do you think about this from your angle? Has Europe proved to be a useful partner in terms of attracting finance? And I want to ask you specifically, because you're from South Africa, there's a lot of money in South Africa. Why is it that we see, and maybe I'm answering the question, we see that getting local partners is very much facilitated by showing you have had some outside injection of capital. So anyway, I'm sure you'll expand on that.
Yeah, so I think the nature of the African market is that it's very risk averse. So Africa does have, specifically South Africa, a lot of money within its private equity capital markets, its more mature capital markets. Now, the problem is because of the risk averse nature of that part of the market is there's very few players that play within the early stage in Africa, specifically VC. And normally to get ahead in the space, you have to be able to show that you've got skin in the game. And so, but how many investors in Africa have their own money to invest? That's the big problem, first and foremost, right? Not a lot of people. So the barrier to entry to play within the venture capital space is so high and so difficult that's why you have so little players playing within the early stage market, right? What I found the easiest way to get around this has been to get international partners and then come back to my own local government and say, hey, I've got international partners involved. Now, can you also participate? And I found that is probably the best model, because I think with government as well, they're also very risk averse. So they need to be able to see that you are able to raise more capital. But yes, capital is probably the biggest missing ingredient. And because of the nature of how African capital markets are structured. But I do believe we need to find better ways to lessen that barrier of entry. I think that's the biggest problem that we face. The barrier of entry is too high. Access to capital is difficult to play in the space. You'll normally find that it's the most successful investors, the guys that have built companies, that are able to invest. And I think we need to find ways where we create a path for people to just be VCs and create a path for people to get access to capital. But right now, the best route to be able to do it is international capital, then bring that international capital as an anchor for local capital to participate. But I have to say we are getting better. I'm seeing a lot of African governments wanting to invest. And I think previously I spoke about skills transfer. I think this is where skills transfer is also important from a venture capital perspective. We don't have a lot of VC in Africa because a lot of people don't know what VC is. We have a lot of private equity, but a very few people understand what venture capital is. And it's important for that knowledge to be transferred on the value of what an early stage investor plays in an economy versus a value of a later stage investor. So I would think, those are probably the most important thing in terms of Africa, just the risk averse nature of the market. But then how do we then get partners to play that de-risking part to get our local investors involved? I think that's been my conundrum since I've started operating in the space, is getting de-risking partners who then come in to anchor any opportunity that I work on in the market. So it is very difficult, but I think we're getting there.
So you are saying that this would be a great opportunity, this opening people up to the potentials of becoming a venture capitalist, actually putting in more seed money into African startups would be a great opportunity for European partners. Tanja, I know that you've been grappling with these issues for your region within Europe, which is seen as one of the more, or let's say, one of the lesser developed information ecosystems on the European continent. When you hear Sakhile, does anything that he's saying resonate with you?
Yes, of course it does. And I can most certainly say that Western Balkans region still struggles basically to reach the same living standard as in EU, European Union. And unfortunately, business environment in the Western Balkans is marred by some structural barriers quite similar to some of the African countries and what Sakhile was talking about. And if we talk about those barriers, we can most certainly speak about this low consumer purchasing power, complex and inconsistent laws and regulations. Then we talk about fragmented marketplace, And also, even though Western Balkans region count for about 60 million people, we still we have good evidence of scarce capital and digital talent in this part of Europe. And I've been going through some data just this morning about African tech startups, and what Sakhile was talking about. It's maybe important to say that investment in tech startups in Africa in the last couple of years have been 6 times bigger than globally, I would say. And looking at some numbers, I can say that there's also a difference in unicorn startups. For instance, in Africa, there have been 3 unicorn startups, whereas in Europe, there were more than 50 in European Union specifically, and about 100 in China and about 200 in US. So you can see there's a big gap there. And most certainly financial vehicles and access to capital, and not just access to capital, but also continuation of investments, because a number of startups from the Western Balkan region as well, they mostly seek investments of about $100,000 to up to $1 million. But they never go after Series B funding. They never basically go to the next step and become...
Tanja, let me interrupt you. Are they not going to the next step because they don't have a vision, or is it just that the money isn't there for them to do that?
I think there are a number of reasons. They're probably not getting, they're getting probably contracted. Maybe it's because of the market, maybe because it's the return of investment. The return of investment is not generated as expected. From. So there are a number of reasons, but I know that in Europe, about 16% return. There are 16% of returns on venture capital investments, whereas, for instance, in Africa, it's 3% on average.
Really interesting. It sounds like we could have a lot to learn from what's happening in terms of stimulating the ecosystem in the Balkans. And I hope that we'll be able to connect to be able to do that. Nkem, you've lived this. I mean, everything that they are describing, you've been through this with your companies. What do you think we could do differently to build that stronger connection between the 2 continents? And I think you're particularly privileged because you're at home in both. You know them both very well. So what do you think we could do differently there?
I think really it's about building bridges and making sure that also information is available. So, for example, last year I was talking to a community that is engaged in actually funding startups, and they were looking to fund in Africa, but they didn't even know where to start, right? So they don't know, how do you find the deals, where's the deal flow? And for me, it's like, okay, well, you can go here, you can go here, you can go here, and I don't even need to put any effort into giving you that information, right? So I think it's about making sure that you have that exchange and that you have platforms and communities where this exchange can happen, so that the opportunities that are there on both sides, right? Because you have investors like myself. I invest not only on the continent, I invest globally, because I truly believe that there are many, many opportunities, out there, and I dedicated 50% of, my investable funds into investing on the continent, but the rest I, sort of can invest wherever I want. But if I don't have access to networks that give me that deal flow, it will be very difficult for me to say, I want to invest in Europe or I want to invest in the US, for example. So I think it's really important to, sort of figure out, how do we build those networks? How do we build platforms as well, where deal flow is available? And, there are some really interesting platforms like that coming out of Nigeria at the moment, where you basically can, sort of invest into startups on a platform. The entire DD process is being done on there. So it's really, I think, an interesting time, but I think it's a lot of it is about information being in the right hands and being passed on, and communities being built, and, you know, sort of people who do have feet on both continents to sort of build those bridges and to be connectors of the different ecosystems, because I do think that there's a lot of knowledge transfer that can happen both from Africa to Europe as well as from Europe to Africa. I don't think it's a one-sided, learning curve. And, you know, I've lectured at different, panels in Europe. I've spoken at the European Commission, and I've shared the, sort of experience and knowledge that I've been able to gather on the continent and the learnings as well as recommendations. And I think that's really important to make sure that we have experts on both sides engaging and speaking to each other.
This sounds really interesting, Nkem. And I want to give you a follow-up question, because I spoke, I said, Sakhile, you got lots of money in South Africa. I think that Nigeria, as everyone knows, is the powerhouse of our continent. And there's many movies that attest to how flush you are with cash. Why is it that we've got some great VCs that have come out of Nigeria, but still we see Nigerian startups looking for that connection that will allow them to attract funds from abroad? Is it the same logic that Sakhile shared, that once you have some money from somewhere, they look at you differently?
To be honest, I don't think that is necessarily true. I think there's a lot of, especially angel funding in Nigeria. I'm one of the angel investors that invest through Rising Tide Africa. And what we're seeing is that there's much more, sort of local pre-seed funding, and much more investors, much more startups are actually looking for that local funding, because you then also, especially through angel networks, get local support, right? So you get mentorship, you get access to local networks, you get people who are invested in your business, not just with their money, but also with their hearts and their minds, right? And that understand the local context. And I think what we're seeing currently here in Nigeria specifically is that there are sort of undercurrents happening around regulation of angel investing, regulations around VC funding as well, right? That are geared towards creating incentives for local investors and ensuring that, startups are able to find local funding and really focus on looking for local funding as well, right? Because at the end of the day, what is happening is that a lot of startups that are a little bit older, and like all we have 3 unicorns in Nigeria. So some of the statistics that were mentioned earlier are a little bit old, probably. So I think what we're seeing with them is that most of them are Delaware companies. They're not Nigerian companies anymore, right? Simply because they've taken foreign funding, which means that taxes don't go here. A lot of the employment doesn't go here. So there are a lot of issues with foreign funding that I think we need to be very careful about. And I do a lot of work in the policy space as well. And this is a really big, sort of point of discussion. How do we keep the money at home? How do we incentivize local funding? How do we build bigger VC funds? How do we create collaboration? How do we create an enabling legal environment that also ensures that investors have the confidence to invest in a Nigerian company versus you have to have a holdco in Mauritius or a Delaware entity or a company registered, somewhere in Estonia or somewhere else, right? So I think that there's a lot happening in that space. But I do think that if you look back the last probably 5 years, there's also a lot changing in terms of local engagement with investing. And because I'm in multiple angel investment networks, I, sort of see deals almost on a weekly basis, and there is so much going on. And the angel networks are collaborating across Africa through the African Angel Network. that also collaborates with the European business angels, right? So there is a lot of knowledge exchange, I think, in that funding space already happening, and I'm excited to sort of see where that goes in the future.
Wow, this sounds really exciting in terms of the level of collaboration that's already happening between networks. One of the questions that still remains for me, though, is if we're looking at this Europe-Africa Connect for Impact, we have a number of bridges, you could say. One bridge is government to government, and we've been amazed by the level of commitment of, for example, the German government and GIZ in supporting startups in Africa. But we've also been talking about perhaps a lack of real understanding from some governments in terms of what their potential role could be to help build those bridges and help create that impact. So, Lena, have you worked at all with governments? What would you see as the government role? Where does the government role fit, and where does the private sector fit? Is it at different stages of the development of the ecosystem?
I worked with or looked at many governments here in Europe, less so in Africa, to be honest. I mean, I see it here in Austria, for example. We have amazing governmental programs supporting entrepreneurship, especially in the really, really early stages with money and mentoring. I think Nkem already touched on it. I think the governmental role is mostly important, like on the long term, in kind of securing an ecosystem where money can come in and then make an impact. And I think preparing this kind of circumstances where you have the legal security, financial security, that you feel good to do business in another country, I think this is for sure the most important role of a government. And like when I look at the problem that we had here with kind of female founding teams, like investors being mostly like older white male, and then they like to invest in what they know, so they mostly invest in teams that are like them. And I think this is the topic with Africa and Europe as well. So I think this changed a lot. So in the last year, I think at least three funds have been raised in my environment that really focus on African startups as well, because people are looking for new opportunities. There's so much VC money coming in, and funds have been raised, and there are not enough opportunities to also invest in the markets they have traditionally focused on. So I think it changed a lot, and a lot of money is also going to Africa. But then, of course, I want to be sure that there is the circumstances that I also feel comfortable investing in. And then again, building bridges also with the local communities to make sure that there is the deal flow coming in, that there is people that really understand the local ecosystems. And I think this building bridges to the local people is then way more important to also make sure that the money is successfully invested.
I think that was really fascinating for me, because one of the big issues on the continent is that our digital ecosystems are seen as very much oriented towards educated urban elites. And there's a disconnect with actual communities on the continent. And I'm going to go quickly backwards now. And then after we've gone back to Sakhile, I will ask for each of you to give your final comments as the hour is rapidly coming to a close. Nkem, do you have anything to do with supporting female founders? Does that make any sense? I think you agree with broadly what Lena has said, But is there anything that you really disagree with that any of the panelists has come out with? I love panels where people are not in harmony because everybody comes with a different experience.
So, I mean, as I said, I'm part of an all-female angel network. Our preference is to invest in female founders. And we also offer mentoring, access to our networks, as well as any other sort of support that we can give in terms of technical resources. So that could be marketing, support. It could be legal support. It could be any type of operational support that they require. So I do think that there is a big, sort of gap in terms of access to finance for female founders. I also think that a lot of the time female founders are not as bold as the boys, right? We see constantly men coming to pitch and, I'm like, you have no business. You have no, this is like an idea. I don't understand. Why are you here? But they pitched with so much confidence. And 2 weeks later, you read that someone gave them money, right? And I think that we need to also, empower women to have that level of confidence to go in there and, black their way through it. Because most of the time we do have substance, most of the time we do have good ideas, and most of the time we do build really, really great businesses. But I think it is about creating that support.
I just wanted to ask you, because I just realized that we've been focusing on government and the tendency will be thinking of national government. But where do you see RECs, institutions like ECOWAS, or even at the continental level, the African Union or the Economic Commission for Africa? Do you see that it's realistic to look for support there, or we should really just focus on the private sector?
I think it would be great to get support from there. And I know that there, in terms of regulation, especially at the African Union level, there, is quite a lot happening in terms of unified policies for the startup ecosystem and things like that. But I think everything is moving very, very slowly because there are still hurdles within the individual countries that haven't even been tackled yet, right? So it's easy to say, okay, because I think, especially after signing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think there's a lot of possibilities and a lot of opportunities that we can explore as a continent, and a lot of value and wealth that we can create by working together and by having unified policies, by having open borders, by, sort of really thinking about how do we make it easy for money to move across the continent, right? Because that's still a really big issue. Some of the startups are solving this issue, but how do we also make sure that trade is available across the continent, so that I, as a founder in Nigeria, I can sell my services across the continent, and I don't need to think about, okay, it's going to cost the same amount of the product to even ship it to South Africa, for example, right? These are things I think that we need to address at that African Union level, right? How do we build the infrastructure for logistics to become easier? How do we build policies that allow free movement of funds so that a Pan-African, sort of transfer becomes super easy? And I do think that with what we're seeing with, sort of CBDCs being adopted by several governments across the continent, that we would then be able to have some of the Pan-African banks do currency swaps in CBDC currencies that would be instant and would be immediate. But I do think that we're still about maybe 2 or 3, maybe 5 years away from that becoming an actual reality. There has to be more awareness. There has to be, I think, really what the biggest problem is stakeholder engagement at that government level, for them to really understand the opportunities that technology and building the technology ecosystem can bring to the continent, and the fact that we have a very short window in terms of actually leveraging the opportunities that present themselves today.
Oh, thanks, Nkem. I think you've given a lot of food for thought. And Tanja, I mean, listening to what Nkem was saying about engagement. Have you found that the regional bodies have been supportive of what's been going on in the Balkans? Are you, I found her comment about the AFECTA, the African Free Trade Act, very interesting. I wonder how Europe is engaging with that. Is it seen as competition, or is it being supportive? Have you ever heard of it even? I would love to hear your views around how you see government getting involved, especially when it comes to regional.
Yes, well, I must say that United Nations have a really strong presence in the Western Balkans and are predominantly working with governments to basically make systemic changes in our societies. And I just must say that this change has been quite slow, and particularly this part of Europe that's been kind of burdened with wars and atrocities that were happening in the 90s. We are still kind of considered to be, countries that are transitioning. So we are still kind of sort of like in this transition period, like becoming grown-ups, I would say, becoming part of European Union and being stable, I must say. In that sense, and just to continue to what Kim was saying about investment and again, gender differences in startups, my opinion is that we really need to start working with girls at their earliest ages and sort of empower them and encourage them to consider IT as their choice for learning, as their choice for the future. We really need to work together with them to increase their competitiveness, their digital literacy. If we want to see them thrive in the 21st century, if we want to see them thrive in the digital societies that we all are part of today. Yes, government plays a crucial role, but in my work in the past 4 years, we've been heard, I must say, and it's mostly from ministries of education, but we really need to have others as well to sort of jump on ship and help us build this a better and stronger society with both genders involved, I would say.
Who would be the
I don't know if
apart from the government? Are you thinking of companies particularly, or?
Most certainly.
For example, I mean, we've been, Nkem reminded us that the information flow is both ways, but would the Balkans be looking for African investors, for example?
Most certainly, why not? I mean, Africa as with 54 countries and a population of 1.2 billion, is most certainly very, very interesting, should be very interesting to subs, and this connection should be most certainly two-way in terms of looking at some of the issues that are in front of people in the Western Balkans that I mentioned previously are basically the same as in or similar to ones that are faced by people in Africa. So I don't see a reason why shouldn't there be exchange of knowledge, exchange of experiences, and exchange of business.
Excellent. Sakhile, we're coming back to you now. I just realized that this is fun. We have a man in the minority. So they've all been talking about women. Sakhile, what's your take on women in this space? And then what do you think about the issues that we've been discussing in terms of where do governments come in? How do the new developments in terms of free trade on the continent, how would they affect the relationship with Europe, for example. And and I will seek directly into your final remarks, so this would be the last time you speak, so you can say everything that is on your mind.
Yeah, so in regards to women, right, I think the biggest mistake that we make as men is we think we understand women, right, and we understand their suffering. And that's what I've learned while building my business, that I don't really understand the suffering. I don't really understand the pain points that women go through, right? And so we have a female founder, part of our business, who helps guide us in terms of the struggles that women face, right? And she sits at the highest decision-making table within our fund to really help us understand those complications, because we think we understand, but we really don't. I think for us, what we've seen in terms of women, because we operate within a niche in VC. We don't operate within what I call common VC. Our fund operates within the IP commercialization space. And that's the space that, for example, turns R&D research into commercially viable products. And what we've seen even within that space is we've got some of the best female scientists on the continent, but because they're not brave to speak up about what they've invented, what they've patented, you see that they don't get access to funding as much as the guys. And so, like, part of our mandate is basically our LPs have given us a mandate to discover those types of female founders and to give preference to them, and to ring-fence capital that is designed for female engineers who've created unbelievable thing that the world needs to look at. So I think, again, what we're seeing within our space, which is, I think, within South Africa, there are only 2 funds which operate within this space, which means it's a growing space. But what we're seeing is there's a lot of participation by our local government, right? I've been involved in this space for, I think, the past 12 to 18 months. And South Africa is really now trying to re-engineer its position in the global context in terms of technology, to be a feeder of technology to the global markets. And part of that is, for example, we spend billions of dollars in R&D, but from that billions spent, we're not turning that into commercially viable products. And so we've got the natural resources in country to build some of the best technology in the world. And what we're now trying to restructure as an economy, saying, how do we then take this incredible knowledge that's been developed in our R&D institutions and really build commercially viable products? And that's become a national discussion. So the beauty of that becoming a national discussion is a lot of things have been brought to the spotlight, like the lack of assistance that has gone to female scientists in our R&D institutions. And so there's a lot of actual intentional focus by the government to provide support. I'm actually speaking at an event, I think, in 2 weeks. I think the World Intellectual Property Organization has invited me, and I think it's also the World Bank. I think it's an event. It's a collaborative event around how does Africa take its intellectual property to the globe. And part of that is...
Sakhile, why would you see Europe fitting in that?
Again, go-to-market, right? I think go-to-markets, what we've seen is a lot of successful R&D institutions in Europe have done this successfully, taking R&D and taking it to market. I think Africa does not have a problem in terms of creating this incredible innovation. What we have a problem with, what we've seen in our context, is lack of knowledge to go to market. And what we found is by collaborating with professors in some of the most prestigious universities in Europe, we found that if we brought some of that knowledge and then contextualized it for our local context, we found that it has helped our technology transfer officers within these R&D institutions really begin to put policies in place that protect the inventor, but also then those policies are designed to take those products to market. So there's been a lot of learnings for people who've done it before. And as we restructure as an economy, we don't have the know-how. And so that's the benefit that we've seen working with institutions that have actually done it. But again, there's also a problem with that, right? You can't just copy and paste. And so there's a lot of contextual analysis that has to go through that when we take things from Europe or working with these professors, it has to be within context. And one of those contexts is, for example, South Africans feel like with colonial and apartheid that has happened is we feel like all our know-how has been taken by Europe. And so there's a lot of those uncomfortable discussions that are being had. And so how do you protect the local inventor for them to feel like they're contributing, they're part of the wealth creation discussion, right? So there are also those very difficult conversations in collaboration that have to happen for the European partners that we work with to understand that you can't just copy and paste what's happening in your environment to this environment. So yeah, I think our part of what we do is very, very different to I think what we say common VC on the African continent. There are a lot of players, and we also work with publicly funded R&D. So you have to take into consideration government policies on how you take things to market, because all of what we do is taking billions of rand worth of publicly funded IP and taking it to market. And so what we do is more of a developmental VC aligned with the actions of what the South African government wants to do. So we don't invest. We invest.
Thank you. I mean, it's very insightful. Is there any last comment you'd have as we move to the other panelists?
Yeah, I think my last, I think just learning. I think what I find is the most critical thing is we should stop assuming. I think in VC, I find that a lot of people assume.
Okay, throw away our preconceptions and look at the realities on the ground. Tanja, any last comments on that and what you've heard?
Yes, I'd like to thank all the panelists and just to give the message that if we really want to create an innovation ecosystem, we need, aside from capital is necessary, but we need entrepreneurs. We really need, leaders with a fresh mindset to bring to community and to bring the community to the next level. So we need to cherish this culture. I would say that where failure is also acceptable. So that's something that we also need to take into consideration, because that's also one of the obstacles, I would say, for startups in the Western Balkan region, this fear of failing. It could be the legacy from the old system. So with that said, I hope that collaboration between the two continents in this startup world will continue on, and WSA is most certainly the fertile ground for achieving those goals and elevating not just startups, but also women and female founders in this area. Thank you.
Wonderful. It sounds like you were making my closing remarks, but I think you make some very good points. Nkem, any last words for us? I'm surprised we didn't have any tough questions in the chat. Nothing has been brought to my attention. I guess the panelists blew away the audience with the depth of their knowledge. So any last comments?
I think the last comment really is around focusing on collaboration and deepening sort of the connections that an event like the World Summit Award already, sort of create for us, right? And making sure that there are sort of actionable plans of cross-continental exchanges where, first of all, investors can learn from each other, as well as founders can learn from each other, because I think there are sort of layers to this exchange that has to happen within the ecosystem, right? And the last layer is where governments can learn from each other, right? There are in Europe some countries like Estonia, for example, that have really, sort of invested in their technology, invested in their startup ecosystem, and where some of the, sort of global startup brands actually come from. And, if you don't do your research, you just be like, oh yeah, that's an American company. But a lot of them are actually from Estonia. So what are the lessons that, at a governmental and policy level that we can learn? What are the lessons that we can learn from a go-to-market approach? What are the lessons that we can learn as investors? What are the lessons that we can learn as founders? I think we need to bring all the different parts of the ecosystem together and really look at the ecosystem as a value chain and find engagement across that entire value chain. Thank you.
Thanks, Nkem. And then over to you, Lena, before I give a few closing remarks.
Yeah, I can also just say that it was a really inspiring discussion, and build on what Nkem just said, that I think these personal connections that we gain through these events, such as WSA, is exactly the fertile ground where we can then later on build on. Let's hopefully on one day when I also invest in startups, that our generation does something better than, I would say, the generations before us, really making sure that we also invest globally. And then I think all these connections are going to be really, really amazing, making sure that we get the deal flow in the local communities, that we get the know-how, the skills. And this is why I'm happy that I was invited. Thank you so much. And now over to you, Dorothy.
Thanks. I must say that I learned a lot from this panel. And Sakhile, it's good to learn what you've been up to since you left Ghana. And we're always willing to welcome all of you back to Ghana. It's interesting. What we're seeing at one level is predictable. We want people to throw away their preconceptions and actually get to know what's happening on the ground in both continents. This is a mutual learning process, and probably, just as one of our panelists said, the younger we start, the better. And hopefully we can, well, we do have a lot of young Africans studying in Europe, getting to know the European context, but usually we see the Europeans coming in a little later when they may have acquired some images from media that are not the best for the continent. But there's always opportunity for relearning, knowledge sharing. And one of the most important points that was made here is regarding money and the networks that help the deal flow. But at the same time, how perhaps we need to reshape the way investment is done so that it's actually supporting the growth of jobs and innovation on the continent and not taking away resources. So I liked Nkem's point about the Delaware issue. You know, is the company still an African company? It's had to be registered elsewhere in order to attract the foreign capital. There's a lot we have to do to perhaps change the way the business model has been operating so far. And the African Free Trade Growth and Opportunities Act perhaps is a new dimension of the discussion that we need to pay attention to. And while we must stop saying Africa as if it's a homogeneous entity. We also have to look at Africa as a trading partner in its entirety and how we improve those flows. So definitely, I'm hoping that those who have joined us on this brief panel discussion have got to know some very interesting people who you can connect with in future. And I hope that the panel will result in a lot of new partnerships and a lot of new thinking around these issues. I see that friends have joined us from Latin America, there are friends who have joined us from Asia, and we have to promote that understanding so that we grow together. So thank you all. I'll now hand over to Manuela, and let me just say to the WSA team, thank you for helping us to overcome the bias between Microsoft and Mac. that didn't allow my face to be shown properly. And thank you for pulling together such an interesting group of people for our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you so much for this fantastic moderation. Thank you to this great panel. It was a very interesting, enlightening discussion.